Welcome to this scribbly lesson on The Three Fates by Rosemary Dobson. This is a really fun poem, and it's difficult at first to kind of get what's happening, but then quickly, once you've understood the main kind of unusual thing about the story, it all sort of clicks into place and makes sense. So if you're reading this poem and you're really confused and that's why you're watching this video, I recommend watching this video, making sure you understand what happens. And when you know what happens, it all kind of clicks into place and you can analyze it a lot better at that point. And at that point, you should enjoy it quite a lot. So it reminds me of certain films like Benjamin Button, where it's actually a story by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it got turned into a film a few years ago. But the idea is that the guy, as he gets to the end of his life, he starts reverse aging and he becomes younger. And there's also a few other kind of stories that use this type of idea. So the main thing to get your head around is the idea that it's trying to kind of reverse the sense of a life, or it's going backwards somehow in time. So I've got quite a lot of content on this one. So normally what I do is I read the poem aloud at the beginning of the lesson. I'm not going to do that here just for the sake of making sure we get through all the content in quite a short space of time. So if you have the time, I recommend pausing me now and just reading the poem aloud to yourself, especially if you've not read it before. Definitely make sure you do that before you actually go into the next part of this lesson. And I didn't actually do any vocab for this one either, so I normally do vocab. I felt like everything is quite obvious here. There might be a couple of words that you're not sure about, so I'll just kind of really quickly. Oh, it doesn't let me highlight. um, I'll really quickly go through those now. So this word on the second line, aberration, means something that is not normal or it's not following the normal pattern. Agony is something really painful. And regressed is where you go back to a previous state of something. Like if your behavior is regressing, you might be acting more like a child than like an adult, that kind of thing. So regression is where you go back into something. And I think that's it really. There's not too many complex words. It's quite a modern poem, and the more modern they are, the fewer strange words they seem to have. So yeah, hopefully you can understand in terms of language this poem quite easily. So we're going to have a quick look at the story now. I've tried to break this down as clearly as possible, but like I say, the structuring and the story is really a bit of an odd one on this on this poem. So hopefully it clicks with you. If it doesn't, feel free to download the document of notes that I've made at the end of the lesson, look through those, and kind of just keep going over it until it clicks. So, stanza 1, the speaker tells us about a man who made a mistake. He was drowning and he was about to die, but in the final moments, he called to the fates to make him immortal. We're going to go into what the fates are later, so if you're not sure, just bear with and we'll get there. So basically, he doesn't want to die in his moment of death. So instead, he asks to be given life everlasting, which we call immortality as well. Then we're told that he lives his life in reverse, so he starts living his life backwards, which is where the unusual structure of the poem comes into play. As he's living this life backwards, he suffers. So he's kind of feeling a lot of emotions, and he's sort of feeling them in the wrong order, so they don't quite make sense to him. He writes poems in reverse, so he's writing his feelings down on a page backwards, and he wipes his tears away before he cries. So again, this sense of unnatural order of emotions. And then the speaker is just called him or he. Sorry, not the speaker, the subject is called him or he, so the man in the poem. And then there's also a her who's introduced in the poem here, so she. And it's really important that they're not named. Definitely analyze that if you've got to write an essay on this one. So with both him and her, they're random kind of archetypal men and women. We'll go back to archetypal as well later, what that means. But instead of thinking of a specific man with a name or character, it's a very general picture of a man that we're given and a general picture of a woman. So we assume that she in the poem is a partner or wife or something like that. And the man's life runs backwards and he watches her, but also become younger and turn back into a child. So he sees her life regressing as he regresses too, to use that word regression that we came up with earlier. So finally, then, in the last stanza, the man reaches the beginning of his life, and there's a tiny little brief pause of sort of nothingness, like a breath. And then his life starts going forwards again, and it unravels in front of him like a film reel. So it suggests that his immortality, when he asks for life everlasting, he has been given that, but also not in the way he expected. So normally, if you had three wishes and you asked to be immortal and have life everlasting, what you would mean is, I just don't want to die, so I want to carry on my life as it is and, go through the world doing whatever I want. So that's what he assumed he would get when he asked for this, but what he actually gets is to just go back and forth over the same life again without end, which becomes a kind of torture rather than a positive experience. So when he is born at that moment, at the end of the poem, his life starts to unravel forwards again. So he's going to grow up and he's going to meet his wife, and then he's going to get to the point where he's drowning. And then just before he drowns, or just as he drowns, he's going to reverse and go back to when he's born. So that's the important bit, and that's the kind of tricky bit to sort of visualize in your head because it's quite unusual, like I say. I really like it, but it is really odd. So yeah, he's going back and forth through his memories and experiences from beginning to end and back again. He never lives any more than he already has, and he never dies either. So it's a sort of like a be careful what you wish for type situation, If a genie gives you wishes and you wish for those things, make sure that you're careful about how you'll receive them because they might not be what you expected and they might not actually do you any favors. So hopefully you're okay with that story in summary. Like I say, spend more time with it if it seems unusual to you. And once it's clicked, you should be able to analyze this poem quite easily. So I find after you understand what's going on, it's actually a really easy poem. And like I say, there's not complex language or anything like that. It's just the structure is a little bit weird. It also means that when you analyze this poem in an essay, you should definitely talk about the structure. So pay attention to the structure form points that I'm going to give you in a minute. So, speaker voice then. In terms of the speaker, it's we don't know if they know the man or not, but they're kind of telling the story like a narrator, as if they're an omniscient third person narrator, like they're not a character within that world. So, third person omniscient narrator is a very removed perspective where we feel like we're kind of observing something happen. We're not kind of in the middle of the action of the story. It's also in past tense, which is really important, and that is a kind of structural point as well that you can make. So it's not happening now, it's something that's already started happening and is happening, we assume, still. So again, this idea of being forced to relive his life playing backwards and forwards forever is really central. But the fact that all of this has happened means there's nothing we can do to change that. We can maybe just learn from his mistake that we don't make the same. Um, yeah, so he's going back and forth from birth to drowning, as I mentioned. So we have a sense that the speaker, which is a different name for the narrator in a poem, you can call them narrator or speaker. So we have a sense of their attitude. They see this alternative to death as a form of constant suffering, like I've already said. So they're not positive about this. It's not like, oh, great, he lived forever, happily ever after. He doesn't get a happily ever after. He gets a kind of unnatural and difficult existence. So it's kind of making the point that just accepting natural death as the end to your life is much better than wishing you were going to live forever, wishing for eternal life or life everlasting. There's also sadness. So there's a tone of sadness. Tone is actually a technique. I'm going to bold that. Everything that's in bold, by the way, is a technique. So it just kind of gets you used to that terminology that you should be using in your essays. And feel free to write any of these points down as you go through the course, as usual. So, yeah, a sad tone, a tone of sadness in the poem. So, we think that the speaker is sort of sad about what happened to the man, and maybe the speaker is retelling this story so that we as readers don't make a similar mistake with our own choices. So, there's nothing that can be done for him now, but as we learn more about this story, we can maybe avoid the same problems in our own life. And you might be thinking, well, this is a really far fetched situation. There's no way I'm going to be dying, and suddenly, as I die, a random God is going to give me eternal life, but then that life's going to be torture. It seems like a very unlikely thing to happen. So, yeah, if you think logically, it doesn't make sense. But if you view it more as a kind of metaphor for like, you shouldn't just wish for things to be a different way because that way is unnatural and maybe that's not right or it's going to cause you more suffering than accepting the natural way of life or natural things that happen. Maybe if we see this death as a metaphor for kind of anything bad or anything that causes panic or disaster in our lives, instead of wishing that it didn't happen, maybe we should accept it as natural and we should learn to work with it rather than against it. So I think it's kind of like a more broader metaphor. It's not just like literally at the end of your life, you're going to have the opportunity to just go back over it, and ask for life everlasting. It's more metaphorical. So it's like anytime something bad happens to you, instead of trying to avoid it or wishing it was different or trying to find a way around having to deal with it, maybe go through it and accept it as natural. And that will, in the long term, cause you less suffering. So, if we read that as a message in the poem, which I do think is something that's present there, it becomes like quite a powerful message and quite a powerful example that the speaker is relaying to us. So, we're going to have a look at language now. I just picked out some of the main language features, so there are a lot more than this, and I'd encourage you to go back over and find your own and analyze them in your own personal way because this makes a huge difference to the quality of your essay if you have your own personal interpretations as well as other ones that you've read or studied with me and from other revision places. So yeah, I just picked up on like a few that were really they stood out to me, but there are a lot more than this in there. The first one is the simile, he came up like a cork. So basically, he's drowning in the middle of a sea, I imagine it as, and he suddenly shoots up out of the water in a very fast, quick way, similar to how a cork pops out of a wine bottle. So there's this kind of feeling of intensity and pressure that builds up just before a cork pops out, and then suddenly it makes this kind of explosive sound and it gets propelled out very quickly. So you have this alliterative C sound that imitates that explosion as well, this like alliteration of came and cork, and also like the K in the middle there. So you could even say a C and a K sound because they're quite similar. Yeah, so it's just kind of enforcing that motion, that action that the man's going through. There's some open vowel sounds, especially in this phrase, enormous agonies of passion. As you say that, you have to kind of open your mouth wide because of all of the vowels there that are making you kind of speak sort of more open with your mouth. Sounds a bit crazy, but if you say it aloud, you'll know what I mean. So that kind of imitates this idea of like screaming or moaning or like being in pain, or feeling intense passion as well. So it's kind of just emulating those feelings there, this intensity of feeling. Also, agony and passion seem like They're an oxymoron, which is another technique. Like they shouldn't really exist together because passion is usually something very positive and agony is something very painful and negative. So it seems a little bit contradictory there. So there's multiple interpretations there, and again, I encourage you to print this off or download it and read more into those interpretations if you have the time, because when you write essays, alternative readings and alternative interpretations are what get you a really high grades if you're aiming for those A star grades like level 7 to 9. You need to be sensitive to multiple interpretations rather than just talking about it and this definitely means that kind of way. So yeah, feel free to go through those in more detail. There's a sense of continuous verbs: writing, brushing away, loving, swinging, growing. Continuous verbs are just really easy to pick out as a technique. They're just anything that ends in ing that happens to be an action. And they create a sense of constant movement and flow. So they show that his life is in flux, it's in movement, it's not static, it's not standing still. So even though we're kind of given imagery and we're given a progression of images, um, those images move so quickly it almost feels like a film that we're watching, that is a kind of film in reverse. Growing younger is also another oxymoron that I identified there. We have compound adjectives, so this is when you've got descriptions that are hyphenated like that. So instead of bear and foot being separate, they're kind of stuck together or straw hatted. So they're kind of compressing. You read them quicker than you would if there was just a space between those words. So it makes it feel like it's rushing faster and faster as he gets back to the beginning of his life. So it speeds up the pace of reading. Pace is a really good structural thing to talk about. And it basically like feels as if the visual imagery that we're presented with, which is also another technique. Just realized now as I'm going through it that I've like missed loads of techniques in bold. So yeah, you might notice that there's more techniques that I've not actually emboldened as well. It's visual imagery, but it's like in note form, like really choppy and quick. Like his life is flashing very quickly before his eyes, which is an important idea that we'll come back to later. And finally, for language, there's consonants, the real unrolling towards the river. Almost every word in that phrase has an R sound or more than one R sound. So it creates a kind of rolling feeling as the reel, the film reel, or the possibly a fishing reel. I think I interpret it personally as a film reel, but because it's a kind of water image as well with him drowning, it could be a fishing reel. So yeah, that's another double interpretation there. So yeah, the reel is unrolling, and the R sound creates that kind of rocking forward momentum throughout that phrase. And this kind of links us back to the idea of fates, who symbolize the thread of life, or the reel kind of symbolizes the thread of life and reminds us of the fates. We'll go into that in the context. So we've got some structure points as well here. The first line is a single sentence, and you might have noticed that it feels a bit more abrupt than the rest of it. Everything else kind of flows a lot in terms of the images, whereas when we first start, it's just like, it just tells you a sentence and you're like, oh, okay, that's strange. So yeah, it's kind of abrupt. It sort of like stands out visually, it stands out in terms of sound because you create a pause before you flow into the rest of the poem. So some of the stanzas are end stopped, meaning that they have full stops at the end of them, but no other stanza has like a stop in the middle of it. So it's the only stanza that has this kind of abrupt single sentence line. Another sense of abruptness. Abrupt is a very good word, by the way. If you don't know what that means, it just means like really short and sudden, like you don't expect it. Some of the final lines of the stanzas are half finished. They're not as long, the line length is not as long as you'd expect. So life everlasting, for example, if I just scroll back up, you can see it just kind of sticks out there. It's not long like how we'd expect it to be, or return to the house as well. Barefoot, straw hatted, deliberately short lines. Um, yeah, there it is. Yeah, so I feel like they kind of make the images or the ideas stand out because they're more direct and abrupt. I feel like they're kind of significant moments in his life, so we're meant to pay attention to them. And I also feel like the lines get shorter as the stanza progresses. So they start with long lines at the beginning of the stanza and then short at the end. And this kind of represents that like backwards feeling that he's doing where he's getting his life's getting shorter as it goes along because he's aging backwards into his childhood. So I feel like it kind of creates that backwards feeling as well to the poem. Tercets is a word for three-line stanzas, so make sure that you can use that. So I've just been calling them three-line stanzas up to now, but the actual poetic term is tercets, so it's a lot more kind of professional to put that in an essay. Yeah, so there's irregular line length, but regular stanza length. So, like I was saying previously, there's some short lines, but there are always tercets, always three-line stanzas. So I think that this represents the tension between order and chaos in the world, or between these themes of fate and free will. So the fates, the three sisters that are mentioned in the poem, they represent order. They impose their own structure on the world. They control the lives of humans. And free will is to do with the man. He chooses at that moment that he doesn't want to die. So it's kind of exploring that idea of like, are we in control of our own lives or are there mechanisms that control us? Even if you don't believe in a God, you might believe that there's certain rules to life that means you don't have complete control over your own being or your own future. Like, certain things will prevent you from doing certain things you might want to do, for example, or certain things will just crop up as an opportunity and you suddenly take that opportunity and it propels you forward. So you don't necessarily have to be religious to believe in the idea of like order, like a pre-organized sort of structure to the world. So yeah, it's kind of that tension between regular and irregular represents this tension between order and chaos, or between an individual's control over their own life and then some kind of organizational control that they can't get out of. So he exercises his free will because he goes, I'm not going to die. So the fates are like, okay, fine. But then they still kind of control how he lives. He doesn't just get to do what he wants, and he just relives his life over and over. So it's not what he wanted. So it's kind of interesting. It sort of seems to be making the case that um, there are things that control our life, and we shouldn't try and fight against them and go down an unnatural route to our existence. If that doesn't make sense to you, um, I just recommend reading a bit more about the themes of fate and free will because I'm sort of drawing on like a whole philosophy there. And I'm kind of assuming that you know what it is, but you might not have heard of that before. So feel free to read more into that if you're just like, what is she on about? Because yeah, I think you have to kind of know it reasonably well before you'd be like able to understand that kind of aspect to the poem. If you really don't have time as well, just ignore that and find other things to think about. So I always try and give you more in these lessons than you actually will ever need to use in an essay, so you can be selective about what to use and what to ignore. So you never have to understand like every single thing I say or use every point in the same essay. So yeah, parallelism now. This is a repeated grammar structure. So we have a or an plus an abstract noun. So article plus abstract noun, article, abstract noun. So even though the words are different, the grammar is the same, repeated twice. And that actually disrupts the flow of the sentence because you've got this little subordinate clause there with aberration, a mistake, pause, and aberration. So it kind of repeats the structure, repeats the grammar, and focuses more in on these words, mistake and aberration. So mistake is something that you do wrong, and an aberration, as I was saying earlier, something that's not natural. So it's both wrong and unnatural. Flashback is probably the most important structural feature that you can do basically when you're analyzing this poem, because the entire thing is sort of like a series of flashbacks, or a flashback of his life in miniature. So chronology is the order of time, and here we have a reversed chronology. We have a backwards running time frame. So this is the most important kind of powerful technique in terms of structure that she's using. And another really important one is allegory. So allegory is where you use somebody else's really well-known story to kind of propel or boost your own story that you've just written. So she's using the idea of the fates and their purpose in Greek mythology, which we'll look at in context. And she's assuming that we know about that, and that our understanding of that is going to underpin our understanding of her own story that uses these same characters. It also makes the poem have like a mythological or fairy tale feeling or atmosphere to it. So it feels like it's trying to teach us a message. It feels like it's not quite real in a sense, like it's not a realistic, believable story. It's more of a metaphor, as I was saying earlier, for how we should live our lives. And fairy tales and myths are supposed to have that didactic message as well. They're supposed to teach us about something. So you can see how that's kind of inherent in the way that she's structured the story. So finally, the context then. It was written in 1984, so relatively new poem. Rosemary Dobson is an Australian poet who lived in Canberra but was born in Sydney. It's not so useful to know these. 1984 is possibly useful, just so that you know that it's quite contemporary. This is the most important context for the poem. So the fates, they're three characters in Greek mythology that always appear together, and they are either sisters or closely related in some way. And they hold the threads of life for mortals. A mortal is like a human being who will die. So all of us are mortal, for example, is the opposite of immortal. So at the end of a person's life, the fates are said to cut the thread, and that means they stop being in the normal world and they go into the underworld, which is kind of like the Greek version of sort of like hell, but it's not suffering. It's just like hell and heaven in one. It's just like neutral, basically. So these fates, these three figures, then kind of get merged into this general idea of fate, like your fate. So they're physical figures in Greek mythology. They're three women, but then they also represent just this idea of fate. Like, is it our fate to marry the person that we end up marrying, or is it our fate to become some like become a millionaire, or to be like a really famous footballer, that kind of thing. Like, what is your fate? What is your destiny? So you're probably familiar with fate and destiny as an idea, and this is where the idea comes from. This figure of the fates that control life and death, and what happens to us in our life. So predetermined, if you can manage this word, is a very good word to learn. It means something that already is set out for you. So is our life and death predetermined, or can we change our actions, and do those affect the outcome? And that's one of the questions, really important questions in this poem. So yeah, this happens quite a lot in stories, but the man asks for help and he doesn't want to die, and he wants the gods to intervene, so the fates help him. But the wish is not exactly what he expected, and it becomes a kind of torture rather than a pleasure, because He's just going back over the same things over and over again, feeling these emotions. When he runs backwards as well to the beginning of his life, the emotions don't even go in an order that makes sense. So he's trapped rather than free, and we get the sense that he'd have just been more free if he'd allowed himself to die and possibly progress to the underworld. So, yeah, it explores this idea that life flashes before your eyes when you die, which is just like a kind of saying. I don't know if it's true. There's meant to be some evidence for it, but the idea that when people have near death experiences and they feel like they're about to die, you suddenly see all these like moments of their life. It's kind of exploring that, which is more of like a sciencey phenomenon than a spiritual phenomenon as well. So, as a final kind of thing for today, I'm going to just leave you with some themes. Feel free to read through these and come up with your own opinions and statements on these themes. So, the best thing you can do with any essay is to understand the themes and the messages behind them for whatever text you're studying in literature, so poetry or plays or that kind of thing. So, in this case, I've kind of given you a bit of a head start, I've given you my interpretations of these key themes, but I do want you to take these and kind of spend time thinking about them now and jotting down your own opinions on them. So, hopefully, you enjoyed it and you found it useful and you're feeling less confused about this poem now. Feel free to watch all of the other scribbly lessons in the poetry course if yeah, if this one was helpful for you, because I'm sort of in the middle of making them all. So yeah, hopefully you enjoy those as well, and I'll see you again in one of my classes. And yeah, in the meantime, thank you for listening, and yeah, good luck with your essays.